Now, what we'd love to do at this time on a Saturday is talk to one of the great economic commentators in the country, a bloke by the name of Leith Van Onselen, well known to listeners of this show. Macrobusiness.com.au, daily financial and economic news, the best analysis, in my humble opinion, that's available anywhere in the country. Macrobusiness.com.au. Leith Van Onselen, good morning, my friend. I hope you're well.
G'day, Luke. How are you?
I'm good. Do you have a tip in the grand final? Being a Melbourneite, you might?
Yeah, look, I'm actually going for Brisbane. I'm sorry, Sydney Siders. I'm going for Brisbane just because Chris Fagan's an I'm a Hawthorn fan, right. Chris Fagan's an ex-assistant coach at Hawthorn, so I'm a bit of a fan of Chris Fagan, so I'm going for Brizzy.
Well, that's okay. We're going into 4BC in Brisbane, which we haven't done on this show for some time. So there'll be a percentage of listeners that'll be delighted to hear that. Plus your knowledge of the game. Chris Fagan's an interesting character. There were some dramas, I think, when he was perhaps an assistant coach at Hawthorn many years ago, but he just missed out last year. I've never met the bloke nor spoken to him, but he seems like a decent fella. But you're going for the connection with your club, Hawthorn. That's it.
That's it.
Right, okay. RBA on a collision course with the government on interest rates. Look, there's so much to unpack here. There was some pleasing monthly inflation data through the week, according to the Treasurer. You might analyse that all a bit differently. But do you imagine that there's an interest rate cut this year, or will it be next year?
Look, certainly there's going to be a lot of pressure on the RBA to cut rates, and I'm expecting the war of words with the government just to get more and more intense over the coming months. So listeners might recall that Treasurer Jim Chalmers last month claimed that the RBA was, quote, smashing the economy by keeping interest rates high. And on Tuesday, the RBA kept the official cash rate on hold in their meeting, which is every 6 weeks. But Governor Michelle Bullock warned that rates are unlikely to come down this year. And what she basically said on Tuesday was she acknowledged that the headline inflation rate, so that's the one that gets quoted the most in the media, is going to fall below the target rate. But she said that would fall because of the government subsidy, so energy and rent, as well as lower petrol prices that have come down recently. And that the RBA would look through that result and basically ignore it, and it'd focus on what's called underlying inflation instead. So that's basically the inflation rate once you strip out the sort of, volatile items, the most volatile items and the ones that are influenced by subsidies.
Yeah.
And the underlying inflation rate in the June quarter was 3.9%, which is still above the target. Now, this is what makes it interesting, Luke. So on Wednesday, the ABS released, this is the day after the RBA's meeting, the ABS released the monthly CPI indicator, and that fell to 2.7%. So that's a headline inflation rate. So it's a big fall. And the fall was driven by energy and rent subsidies. So electricity prices fell by nearly 18% in the year to August, but without the energy rebates that the state and federal government's given, it would have decreased by about 3%. So there was a massive impact there. And also rents increased by just under 7% in the year to August, but without the rental assistance, that would have increased by nearly 9%. So the government's basically duped the stats here. But the thing about it is the trim to mean inflation, which is basically the underlying inflation, which is what the RBA is looking at, that also fell to 3.4% in August. And most economists think that in the September quarter, it's going to fall within the target. And some analysis by the CBA also showed that there's only around 40% of items in the CPI basket. So they measure like a couple hundred things.
Yeah.
Only 40% of the CPI items now are running above the RBA's target range of 3%. So we are seeing this broadening disinflation across the economy. And I think because it's the headlines fallen below target, we're likely to get the underlying inflation rate, potentially falling within target or, around about that 3% level in the September quarter. There's going to be massive pressure on the RBA to cut rates. And I'm expecting Jim Chalmers to just heap on the pressure and elbow. And the other thing to point out here, Luke, is the actual objectives of monetary policy, which is set out in the Reserve Bank Act. It doesn't actually refer to underlying inflation. It refers to headline inflation. So basically it says that the RBA should try and keep inflation within target of 2 to 3%. So it's not referring to this trim mean thing, which is what Michelle Bullock was going on about on Tuesday. It actually refers to the headline rate. So Jim Chalmers can actually refer to that as well. So I think we're going to see this massive fun fight between the Albanese government and the Reserve Bank over the next weeks and months, putting pressure on the RBA to cut rates, because Albo's going to an election, Labor's going to an election, by May next year at latest. And it knows that if the RBA doesn't start cutting rates, it's going to be in real, trouble electorally, especially given the rest of the world's now cutting rates. And there's obviously cost of living crisis and everything else. So they're absolutely banking on the RBA to cut rates to save their own electoral bacon. But then the RBA on Tuesday said they're not going to cut rates in the near term, yet the data's probably suggesting they should. So it's just going to be a real fun fight to watch here.
The setting of the target band, whose work is that? Is that the work of Treasurer, the RBA? Does it get legislated somewhere? Is it official government policy? What happens with and who makes that the thing?
So it was made years ago under the Reserve Bank Act. So it was sort of done in collaboration between the government and the Reserve Bank. We're talking decades ago.
Yeah.
So when the inflation targeting started, decades ago. So it's been around for a long, long time. But the interesting thing about it, as I said, is it doesn't refer to this underlying inflation. So Michelle Bullock's basically said, we're going to ignore the headline inflation rate, and we're going to look at the underlying inflation rate, because the headline inflation rate's being duped by these subsidies. So it's not a real, fair measure. But the actual act doesn't refer to this underlying inflation rate; it just refers to headline inflation. So, it's set up for a fight between the government. I think, I honestly think the Reserve Bank was a bit too hawkish in its statements on Tuesday. So she pretty much ruled out rate cuts, which probably wasn't a smart thing to do, really, when we are seeing this broadening disinflation across the economy, even without the subsidies. And there's a good chance that the underlying inflation rate, so X those subsidies, is actually going to fall within target in the September quarter. So I think Michelle Bullock might have painted herself into a corner a bit.
Right. But she also appears like someone that won't be bullied by government too, and there's been a bit of that, hasn't there?
I do respect that. Yeah, I do. I certainly do respect that, but I just think the data might go against her.
Right.
And then she's come out so strongly saying rates aren't going to be cut. She pretty much said not this year.
Yeah.
When the data, so we get the quarterly inflation data at the end of October before the November meeting, might actually, contradict her statements.
Yeah, of course. Now,
and then it's going to add fuel.
Yeah. The per capita recession we've been talking about, and you've raised this more than anyone else, although I see the likely political suspects have jumped on board because it's favourable to their stance. But 6 consecutive quarterly declines, 7 over the past 8 quarters, and we've got an OECD economic outlook report, which shouldn't give us all too much hope. Is that right?
Yeah, so Australia's per capita recession has been the longest in modern history, so in data dating back to the early 70s. So we've had 6 consecutive quarterly declines, as you said, and we haven't had that before. It's not the deepest. We had a deeper decline in the early 90s, but not a protracted as long decline.
Yep.
And the OECD released its economic outlook for Australia, and it's actually downgraded Australia's overall growth to 1.1% this calendar year, down from 1.5% previously, and 1.8% next calendar year. So what that basically tells you is we only have GDP data to the June quarter, and it suggests that this per capita recession is going to last at least until sometime into next year.
Yeah.
Which would mean it would have run for, maybe 8 quarters, 10 quarters, we don't know. But what it tells you is that this per capita recession we've had is not going to end anytime soon. And it's going to be, it already is the longest in modern history. It's just going to smash records even more.
Yeah. Gosh. There was another issue through the week that I was going to ask you about, and I was just momentarily distracted by the magnitude of those forecasts. Yes, here it is. It comes to mind. The negative gearing debate. Now, I know because I listen to you closely, and I think our listeners would agree that if you add 1 million people that need somewhere to live and you're not building a whole bunch of new dwellings, then hello, housing crisis. But the conversation about negative gearing, and I think if we hear someone's got 20 properties or whatever it might be, or a portfolio of 50, and you hear that from time to time, and there's not many with that, but there is that. Just help me understand the negative gearing debate. Good thing, bad thing? I think in the 80s, the then Hawke Keating government had a crack, and I've got a newspaper article from those times saying how badly it worked, I think, in Sydney and Perth. But Where do you see the debate, and what should we really be looking at here?
So the thing about negative gearing is it obviously provides tax benefits to those who invest in property. And the impact of it is that we've seen a big rise in property investment in the last several decades. And what that's done is it's effectively pushed first home buyers out of the market. So what I've done previously, I've plotted investor mortgage demand against first home buyer mortgage demand, and they're perfectly negatively correlated. So what that means is that when the amount of investors goes up, or the share of investors go up, the share of first home buyers falls.
Right.
And what that suggests is that investors are crowding out first home buyers. So if the government does curb negative gearing, it will, put moderate downward pressure on prices. It would increase the home ownership rate slightly because you'd have more first home buyers entering the market instead of investors. And I think that's a moderately good thing. We're talking very small amounts here. But the thing about it is, Luke, that with the negative gearing only impacts the price side of the market. It doesn't really impact the rental side of the market. Now, the thing about immigration impacts the price side of the market, so it puts upward pressure on prices and it puts upward pressure on rents, because it obviously means you've got to have more renters. Because if you import 500,000 extra people, those 500,000 extra people need somewhere to live, and that pushes up rents as well. So I think that's why I keep arguing that immigration is a much bigger issue here, because it impacts both prices and rents, whereas negative gearing really only impacts prices.
Right.
I'm not saying that's not important, but I think the bigger crisis we've got in Australia is actually on the rental side.
Yeah.
Because everybody needs somewhere to live, and if they're not going to purchase, they're going to have to rent. And we're hurting both sides there with the immigration side. Negative gearing only hurts those who want to buy, who are forced to rent. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's not as big a deal as running a massive immigration program as we have done, which is pushing up prices and pushing up rents.
Yeah. All right, mate. Enjoy the game this afternoon. Good to chat. I'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Speak next time.
Great stuff. Thank you. Leith Van Onselen, macro.